The moment itself is procedural. A checklist is followed. A parameter is adjusted correctly. A supervisor pauses the test for another shift. The reactor does not surge. The core does not rupture. The night remains ordinary. April 26, 1986 passes without a name. In Pripyat, people sleep with their windows open. Children dream. Workers wake up for morning shifts that will never be remembered. The air carries no metallic taste. No invisible dust settles on skin, leaves, roofs. Nothing becomes historic. And because nothing happens, the world continues along a path it never questions. The illusion holds for years. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant operates as designed, aging, imperfect, but contained. Minor incidents occur as they do everywhere. Reports are filed. Problems are managed internally. No plume crosses borders. No alarms wake Europe. The Soviet Union does not receive a wound it cannot hide. This matters more than anyone realizes. Without Chernobyl, nuclear fear remains abstract. Accidents exist as theory, not trauma. The image of an invisible enemy poisoning land for generations never embeds itself into global consciousness. Nuclear power remains controversial but credible. Countries continue building reactors. Safety improves incrementally, not desperately. The industry is shaped by engineering, not panic. Germany does not rush toward exit. Japan does not carry a European warning in its memory. Public trust erodes slowly, not catastrophically. Energy policy evolves without shock. The Soviet Union changes differently too. Without Chernobyl, there is no sudden exposure of systemic rot broadcast by radiation maps and foreign detectors. No moment when secrecy becomes impossible. No embarrassment so total that it accelerates collapse. Glasnost still happens, but it lacks its most damning symbol. The state is not forced to admit that lies can kill beyond borders. The moral authority of the system decays slower, more quietly. The end still comes, but later and less abruptly. Ukraine's north never empties. Pripyat grows, not into a monument of absence, but into a mid-sized Soviet city that ages like any other. Its Ferris wheel rusts from neglect, not abandonment. Apartments fill with generations. Schools produce graduates who leave and return. There is no exclusion zone. Forests are logged, replanted, logged again. Villages remain connected by roads that do not end at checkpoints. The land does not become a laboratory of abandonment. This changes nature profoundly. In our world, Chernobyl became an accidental wildlife reserve. Wolves, boars, deer, birds flourished in the absence of humans, adapting to radiation rather than retreating from people. In this world, there is no paradoxical sanctuary. Nature competes with agriculture, industry, roads, and noise as it always did. There are fewer wolves, fewer rare birds, more monoculture fields, less myth. The forest does not become famous. It simply exists. People do not become symbols. No liquidators march into history. No firefighters die namelessly from an enemy they could not see. No doctors study radiation sickness at scale. Oncology statistics do not spike mysteriously across regions. Children are born without whispered questions. Is it safe? Was it the milk? Was it the rain? Parents do not carry that doubt. An entire layer of anxiety never enters the bloodstream of Eastern Europe. This absence changes science. Radiation biology advances slower. The world loses a grim dataset it never wanted but learned from. Long-term studies of exposure, mutation, and recovery are never conducted at scale. Knowledge is poorer. Suffering is less. The trade-off is invisible. Culture shifts subtly. There is no Chernobyl as metaphor. No shorthand for hidden catastrophe. No place that embodies the cost of denial so completely that it reshapes storytelling. Disaster narratives remain loud and visible. Fires, floods, explosions you can see. The idea of silent catastrophe stays theoretical. This changes how societies prepare. They plan for what they can imagine. They neglect what they cannot. People trust systems more. Not blindly, but more than they should. The idea that technology can betray without warning remains underdeveloped. Trust becomes habit. By the time decades pass, the absence has consequences. Nuclear energy expands further. Carbon emissions drop faster in some regions. Climate trajectories shift slightly, not enough to save the planet, but enough to delay some thresholds. Cities grow warmer more slowly. Glaciers retreat later. Weather patterns destabilize on a different schedule. The butterfly effect is real but quiet, and beneath all of it, something deeper remains missing. A warning. Chernobyl, in our world, taught humanity that some failures do not announce themselves, that some disasters cannot be localized, contained, or buried, that secrecy is not just immoral but physically dangerous. In this world, that lesson is never learned. The world believes more strongly in control, in procedures, in expertise, in the idea that systems fail loudly. They do not. They fail silently. And because Chernobyl never explodes, humanity never learns how close it came to poisoning itself without realizing it. The chapter ends without sirens.
No evacuasten buses. No evanden toys.
No maps glowing red. Just a world that continues confidently, unaware that one of its most important warnings never arrived. This was not the prevention of disaster. It was the prevention of knowledge. A fundamental loss. The loss of the moment when humanity learned that progress, when shielded by secrecy, can turn invisible error into generational consequence. And this is only the beginning of what happens when the catastrophe that should have taught restraint never occurs, and the world keeps building, trusting, and pushing forward, certain that nothing so quiet could ever hurt it. Time passes, and the absence settles in. Not as relief, as normalization. Years turn into decades, and the world that never witnessed Chernobyl grows into a version of itself that trusts systems a little more, questions authority a little less, and underestimates silence as a form of danger. Eastern Europe ages differently. Without the exclusion zone, there is no vast scar on the map. Northern Ukraine remains populated, productive, ordinary. Farming continues. Industry expands. Towns that would have been erased instead struggle with familiar problems. Unemployment, corruption, slow decay, but not existential displacement. Generations grow up rooted. They do not inherit stories of evacuation at dawn, of animals left behind, of Geiger counters clicking like insects. Their sense of place is continuous. This creates stability. It also creates blindness, because continuity teaches people that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Health statistics tell a quieter story. There is no spike in thyroid cancers linked to iodine exposure. No clusters that epidemiologists argue over for decades. Hospitals treat illness, not mystery. Doctors do not have to explain to parents that the cause is invisible and historical. Suffering is reduced. So is vigilance. The scientific world loses one of its darkest reference points. Without Chernobyl, long-term studies on low-dose radiation exposure are limited to laboratory conditions and minor incidents. The data that, in our world, forced revisions of safety models simply does not exist. Risk thresholds remain optimistic. Confidence stays theoretical. This shapes policy far beyond Ukraine. Nuclear energy continues its expansion with fewer pauses. Reactors are built closer to population centers. Backup systems are improved, but always under the assumption that failure will be detected early and contained locally. Because nothing has proven otherwise, public opinion follows. Without images of abandoned cities and forests reclaiming playgrounds, nuclear power never becomes a cultural fear. It is debated, regulated, protested, but not mythologized. The idea of invisible contamination never embeds itself emotionally. People fear explosions. They do not fear leaks. This distinction matters. Energy transitions happen slower. Renewables grow, but without urgency. Fossil fuels are displaced partly by nuclear, not challenged outright. Climate change advances on a slightly altered curve, delayed in some regions, accelerated in others. The planet warms differently, not enough to avoid crisis, enough to rearrange it. Then, years later, another nuclear incident occurs somewhere else. smaller, contained, technically managed, and the world reacts calmly. Authorities issue statements. Experts explain margins. The public listens. There is no memory of Chernobyl to trigger instinctive distrust. People believe reassurance. This is where the divergence becomes dangerous, because trust without trauma lacks depth. It assumes competence will always outrun complexity. Inside institutions, secrecy remains easier. Chernobyl, in our world, forced transparency by necessity. Radiation does not respect borders. Lies were measured by foreign detectors. That humiliation reshaped international norms. In this world, that precedent does not exist. States believe they can manage internal failures quietly, and for a while they can. The lesson that catastrophe can be slow, cumulative, and unseen remains unlearned. Culturally, something else fades. The image of nature reclaiming human failure never enters the global imagination. There are no haunting photos of trees growing through classrooms, of foxes wandering empty streets, of life adapting to abandonment. The idea that nature might thrive because humans' retreat is never demonstrated at scale. Environmentalism develops without that paradox. It frames humans as protectors or destroyers, but rarely as absentees. The belief that human presence is always central remains intact. People do not imagine what happens when we leave. Psychologically, this has consequences. Humanity becomes more confident in permanence. Cities are built assuming long lifespans. Infrastructure is layered without deep consideration for abandonment or collapse. Decommissioning is an afterthought. The future is imagined as continuous occupation. No one plans for sudden emptiness. Generations later, historians note something subtle. In this timeline, humanity experiences fewer iconic warnings.
No Chernobyl.
No single event that compresses lessons into collective memory. Disasters still occur, but they are fragmented, localized, debated, forgotten. Nothing crystallizes into a universal symbol of technological humility. As a result, when trust finally breaks, when a later catastrophe proves that silent systems can fail spectacularly, the shock is greater, because there was no rehearsal, no cultural memory to soften the blow. In our world, Chernobyl became a boundary, before and after, a point at which humanity learned to fear what it could not see. In this world, that boundary is missing, and so the learning curve is steeper when it finally arrives. The people of Pripyat, who in our timeline became ghosts of warning, grow old here. They retire. They complain about pensions. They tell grandchildren about the plant they worked at, not as a curse, but as a job. Those grandchildren never inherit fear. They inherit confidence. The irony is cruel but quiet. By preventing the explosion, the world prevented suffering, but also prevented understanding. It saved lives and delayed wisdom. The final realization emerges not in Ukraine, but globally. Chernobyl was not just a disaster. It was a lesson humanity never chose, but desperately needed. Without it, the world moves forward smoother, calmer, less scarred, and less prepared. This is not a condemnation of prevention. It is a recognition of cost. Some catastrophes teach by existing. When they do not occur, the absence itself shapes behavior, and sometimes that shape is riskier than the wound would have been. This timeline is not worse. It is not better. It is quieter. And in that quiet, humanity walks a little closer to the edge without knowing how far it has come. This was not the avoidance of tragedy. It was the postponement of humility, a fundamental loss. The loss of the moment when the world learned that progress without transparency can poison land, people, and trust all at once. And that silence is not safety. And once that lesson is delayed, it does not disappear. It waits, just like radiation would have, invisible, patient, unforgiving.